In this video, we're going to do some free verse writing practice with the help of an exercise, and then use a step-by-step process to rework, refine, and edit our draft. So let's get started. Free verse. Free verse. That is free from the rules of formal verse. No one telling you how long or short your poem should be. No one telling you whether your poem needs to follow a certain rhyme scheme, if it rhymes at all. And no one saying or determining, other than you, how long those lines should be. Free verse can literally do anything on the page. It is limitless, and that can be a little daunting. You don't even need to start your poem at the top of the page. You could write an entire poem as a footnote at the bottom of the page. You could write a poem about a flower that appears as a flower on the page. There are many, many ways to tackle free verse, and it's why the poet Robert Frost said that writing free verse was a bit like playing tennis without the net. Now that sounds like he's saying it's easier to play the game. What he's actually saying, I believe, is that when you take the net away and when you decide to play the game maybe outside the white lines on the court, there are no rules to this game. So how do you play the game when there are no rules? And more importantly, how do you win? We're going to find out right now. Because a free verse poem can go anywhere and do anything, sometimes it's difficult to know how our poem should begin or where it should begin. And so for that reason, I'm going to give you some very specific parameters in this poem. We're going to set our poem in a physical location, in a room in your house or apartment. And let's just say for this exercise that room happens to be the kitchen. And the thinking behind this specific location is that it will encourage you to be very specific and focused in the use of language when writing this preliminary draft. You decide who the speaker of the poem is, whether this is some omniscient presence floating above the kitchen looking down on what's happening below, or whether there's a person there alone, or whether they're with someone preparing a meal, or do they have their head stuck under the kitchen sink trying to fix the plumbing, or are they terrified about what the knives get up to in the cutlery drawer when they're not looking? Whatever happens in the interior world of that poem, you decide, and you have to give yourself permission just to not worry about the quality of the writing, but for a minimum of 10 minutes, I would suggest, set your timer, get writing, and when you're finished pouring out that stream of consciousness onto the page, we'll come back and look at some techniques for refining and editing that first draft. So hopefully now, after at least 10 minutes of dedicated writing time, you should have at least one page filled up with the beginnings of a poem, or some ideas at least relating to our kitchen poem. And now we're going to look at a few techniques we can employ to sharpen and refine our first draft. In step one of the editing process, we're just looking over the work and looking for any examples of unnecessary repetition. I don't mean the use of deliberate repetition, which can be used to great effect in a poem. I mean simply repeating ourselves unnecessarily. You might also consider the verb tense you use in the poem. If you start the poem in the present tense and it changes later, there needs to be a good reason for that. So just check over the poem, and this may seem like quite an obvious process, but it's an easy one to miss. Consider also if you've used adverbs in the poem, whether you might be able to find a stronger verb to do the same job. In other words, an economy of language. So instead of saying the man walked quickly from the room, he dashed, he hurried, is going to be more immediate for the reader. And on the subject of grammar, we should also look at the adjectives and the role they play within the poem. This may also come back to the earlier point about repeating ourselves. So make sure that the language is tight and focused in exactly the way you want it to be focused. If your first draft includes simile and metaphor, look closely at those metaphors and similes and ask yourself whether they are examples from the cultural lexicon that we're all familiar with. In other words, are they perhaps a little overused, and is there a way you can reimagine those similes and metaphors in your own unique way? Pronouns are very important in a poem. When you look back over your draft, is the speaker in the poem speaking from a first-person position, talking about the things that I did, the places I went, or is the speaker one step removed, using a third-person narrative, talking about what he, she, or they did? Sometimes the poet casts the reader in the starring role as the subject of the speaker's attention by using you. Shakespeare's sonnet number 18, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? It's not shall I compare her or him or them to a summer's day, it's about you. And so we invite the reader in and make the reader feel more complicit in a way. If you've ever been to a poetry workshop, no doubt you have heard people talking about line endings and line breaks. Because there are no rules about how one line should end and the next one begin, it's a really important thing to consider how you leave the reader at the end of one line leading into the next, because you create some tension and some suspense that happens in a very short space of time, admittedly. But when you get to the end of one line as a reader and before you reach the beginning of the next, what is happening there? How are you leaving your reader? And what word you choose to finish that line is very important. You can also create additional layers of meaning. And I'll give you a good example. In a recent email exchange with a friend who was sharing an early draft of a poem that they were working on, a poem about love and loss, and also about the death of a partner, I read the line, "a still body of water," as the speaker stood beside a lake. Now, initially reading that on my laptop, this was formatted as the writer had intended on one line. But later, opening the same email on my phone, because the screen's much smaller, it had reformatted the text. And what I actually read, and which I thought was more effective, was "a still body," and then "of water" was on the next line. So there's additional layer of meaning referring to the body, not just of the water, but perhaps of the partner who's no longer with us in the world of the poem. I found very interesting. And so it's a good example of how line endings can be very impactful in terms of adding that additional layering of meaning throughout the poem. Just be sure as you cast your eye over this first draft that the language you're using is exact and precise and means exactly what you want it to mean. Two of the process is a little obvious. We're talking about beginnings, middles, and endings. But firstly, the beginning of the poem, is it evocative? Is it inviting? Is it affecting? Does it pull the reader in? Does it grab the reader by the shirt collars? Is it the best way to start this poem? And if not, you need to go back and redraft and refine that first opening line. Next, we want to consider the middle of the poem, or the shifts and changes in direction that may occur within your draft. And wherever there is a pause or a change in a new direction, then I would invite you to consider making that line a new stanza. So we're going to introduce some white space. And this white space or stanza break is going to help the reader understand those pauses and shifts in direction that you're creating and introducing into the poem. Equally important is how your poem ends. So go back to the draft, look closely at that last line, and ask yourself, is this really where the poem is supposed to end? Does it deliver the knockout punch that every last line should? How does it leave, and where does it leave the reader? And you may not have all the answers at this stage, but certainly to be thinking about that is an important part of the process. Step 3, think about the chronology of your poem. It may be that in the writing of a draft, you put things down quickly without thinking about the order of them. Now is the time to go back and look at that and possibly make shifts, moving one section to another place in the poem. Step 4 is to read your poem out loud. And you will find the simple act of reading aloud will allow you to hear where the language gets a little sticky and maybe you find yourself tripping up over the words. And this is a really good technique for going back and being able to refine those lines and the flow of the language in your poem. It's also a good idea to actually record your voice as you read aloud, and then you can actually listen back again and again, trying to work out exactly why the draft isn't working the way you want it to work. And often it's simply a matter of that kind of metrical, rhythmic feel of the language. So consider switching out a word here and there in order to help the flow of the poem. Step 5 is to share the draft of your poem with other writers, a daunting prospect, and preferably do that in a workshop where you will be expected to read your draft out loud while other workshop participants follow along reading the text. Often what happens, this is a strange thing that I've witnessed myself on several occasions in several workshops, that a poet is reading their work out and they make a small subconscious alteration. They maybe change a word that someone that's listening carefully will point out to them after the reading. And there's a reason for that. Ask yourself why your brain decided to make that change, and was it a change for the better? The last step in this process is simply to put your poem away in a drawer, close the drawer, and walk away. Go and do other things. Go for a walk in the park, write other poems, leave it alone for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then come back. And when you come back and you look again at that draft, you'll have a little more distance. You won't have entirely forgotten the draft that you wrote, but you will have forgotten it enough to come with a pair of fresh eyes and look again. And this is an important step in the redrafting process, looking, and you will probably see some other things you want to change. That distance has given you the objectivity to look again and make more edits. If you enjoyed this video, please do click the like button and subscribe. It really helps us to grow the channel. Thanks for watching. Thank you for your support, and we'll be back soon with more content.